Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut's Spring 2021 series talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm delighted to be your host this afternoon. And we're going to talk about Frederick Law Olmsted Landscapes in Connecticut, and to officially kick off our exciting Historic Resources Survey of Olmsted and Olmsted Firm Design Landscapes in Connecticut, a survey project with the team today. But first, a little background about us. You can go to the next slide. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization. We were established in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. We preserve, promote, and protect the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. For over 4 decades, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Shown here, it's the Eli Whitney boarding house built in 1827 to house workers for Eli Whitney's gun factory, and it has served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 8 preservation professionals and an active board of 21 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Chris Wiegren, Deputy Director, contact Chris for our easement program, Connecticut Preservation News, and for book talks. We recently published a book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Trubert is our Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to state and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood, Development Assistant, manages all of our inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, and Stacy Vero, who provide immediate boots on the ground service to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissions, and more, with an array of preservation needs, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, and funding. Next slide. These weekly chats have served as a meaningful way for us to continue our mission. We've been able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind during these months of stay-at-home restrictions. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions directly at the end of the presentation, or contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. So next slide. So with that, I will turn the program over to Christopher Wiegren, our Deputy Director, and our team leader for the Olmsted and Connecticut Survey Project. Joining Chris in presenting today is Lucy Lawless of the Red Bridge Group, and Jenny Scofield of the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office. Together, they will enlighten us on Olmsted and the survey. So Chris, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. Frederick Law Olmsted's 200th birthday is coming up next year in 2022. And in preparation for that, the State Historic Preservation Office and Preservation Connecticut are partnering on a project to document landscapes by Frederick Law Olmsted and the Olmsted firm, which he founded throughout this in Connecticut. Frederick Law Olmsted is somebody many Americans know. Just last night, he was the subject of an entire category on the quiz show Jeopardy! And I'm glad to say that the contestants answered every question in the category correctly. Although, to be honest, many of those questions didn't require extensive landscape knowledge. Still, it's recognition of Olmsted's significance in American history. Many of us know Olmsted as the designer of Central Park in New York and many other significant landscapes across the country. He's part of the people who helped develop the practice of landscape architecture in the United States, and I believe he even coined the term landscape architecture. Olmsted had his hand in hundreds of landscapes all across the country: parks and park systems, parkways, grounds for churches and cemeteries, schools and colleges, hospitals and mental asylums, estates, subdivisions, resorts, gardens, and much more. And the landscape firm that he founded continued to be an important presence in the landscape architecture firm for more than 100 years. Olmsted himself was just one of the remarkable people of the 19th century. Before embarking on landscape design, he had a multifaceted life. Born and raised in Hartford, member of a prosperous family, he would have gone to Yale, but for eye problems, which prevented him from studying. So he knocked about for many years, not quite settling on anything, trying a host of activities. He served as a seaman in the China trade. He farmed. He was a journalist and author and publisher. He served as the administrator of the United States Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. This organization, as a precursor to the American Red Cross, was responsible for providing medical care for soldiers during the war. He also served as the manager of the Mariposa gold mining estate in Florida, California, part of which later became Yosemite National Park. Olmsted traveled throughout the South for the New York Times, writing about what he saw, and the articles and books that he produced from that are vivid firsthand accounts of the workings and economics of slavery, and helped make the case for its abolition before the Civil War began. What ties all these activities together, along with his later career as a landscape architect, and runs through as a constant theme throughout Olmsted's life, is the idea of improving American life and society. He conceived urban parks as engines for strengthening democracy by bringing people from all walks of life together to build a sense of shared community. Olmsted also believed that landscapes had beneficial psychological effects. Pastoral scenery with graceful lawns scattered with groves of trees provided peaceful and restorative respite from the noise and dirt and confusion of city life. Charles Beveridge, one of the preeminent scholars of Olmsted, writes that Olmsted achieved this calming effect by taking his cues from nature. That is, he created landscapes that appeared natural, although in fact they were carefully arranged. He did this by subordinating individual elements to larger landscape effect. In other words, you're generally not supposed to notice a particular tree or flower or piece of sculpture. Rather, you're to be sort of enveloped in a dominating, overall enveloping environment. Olmsted designed his landscapes to guide a sense of movement with carefully planned sequences of views and experiences to provide variety and different emotional effects in those who participated who visited them. Although this project was inspired by Frederick Law Olmsted himself and his upcoming anniversary, it's important to remember that the firm he founded continued to be important and active for many years after his death. Lucy Lawless, former historical landscape architect for the National Park Service and a member of the consultant team, is going to talk a bit about this later history of the Olmsted firm.
First, I have to unmute myself. So first, let me say I'm delighted to be here, and I see some other members of our Red Bridge Group team here with Liz Sargent and Carolyn Brackett on the phone, and we're very excited about this project. And I think one of the most important things to remember is that Frederick Law Olmsted wasn't the first person to do landscape design, but he is distinct in having said that this profession that he began to practice in 1857 with the Greensward plan that became Central Park, that it was more than landscape gardening and all. He fixated on the term landscape architecture. And so that becomes now the professional term associated with the work that he and his firm did through 1979. And this slide is really showing you that Frederick Law Olmsted, who, as I said, begins his practice in 1857 with the Greensward plan submission with Calvert Vaux, had a stepson, John Charles Olmsted, who was his brother's child. And after his brother's death from tuberculosis, he marries his wife, Mary Perkins Olmsted, and continues on to have a larger family. Someone who, the last child born, it became Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who kept the practice going until his death in 1957. And even then, members of that firm practiced until the office closed in Fairstead, the office at Fairstead in Brookline, Massachusetts, in 1979. So it's almost 150 years of work, and some of the most defining work across the country that in being prepared to celebrate the bicentennial of Frederick Law Olmsted next year. We have looked, and the Fairstead, the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site at Fairstead has a collection of almost 6,000 project numbers, most of which were developed into some form and survived till today. So as a nation, we're interested in the full array of projects the firm pursued. But in Connecticut, we'll be most interested in the landscapes that inspired the young Olmsted to even become a landscape architect. What did he see and experience in his youth and early life that moved him towards this profession? And then how often did he come back and then his firm come back to do some of the most important work they did in different areas of the state? And I think we're already seeing that, different areas that were worked in at a time sort of reflect what's happening in the state of Connecticut. So that's very much part of the work we will do in writing the historical context that will accompany the statewide survey of extant projects. So it's very exciting. And so the other thing I think these two photographs reflect is that, the Olmsted firm at these, 2 dates that I learned when I made one visit to the park, if any of you have the opportunity to go, it's a fabulous park to visit, that at the peak of its practice, which was in the 1920s, there were over 100 people working out of that office. And even today, that's a huge number of people to be in one place pursuing a particular practice. So, it is amazing what they accomplished, but, who came to this state, who actually worked, be it senior, one of the sons, or another member of the firm, is something we are hoping to tease out in this next year as we do this work. I think there might be a next slide, Chris. Yeah, I think the other thing is, in doing the work that's been done, the national park was created as the firm closed. I think it was then Governor Dukakis and people in the Boston area who knew of his legacy locally said, this particular place should not be lost. And the National Park Service was the recipient of a unique resource in the national park system. There really is no archive like this that exists at another park. We all have many archives associated with park work by many people, but a single collection of work like the Olmsted firms is, unique because they were pack rats. And when the Park Service got the park, they weren't even aware of what they had received in this physical facility that they got. And when they teased open the doors of a brick building behind the house and office that was just filled to the doors with the detritus of the late 20th century, when they peeled away the tricycles and the ladders, it was a storage area with all these rolled up plans from the practice almost from the beginning. So over the decades since the park's creation, they have carefully curated those plans and drawings. And with the National Association of Olmsted Parks and professionals who've always been associated with that organization, they came up with these landscape thematic categories, and they pretty much fit now with what the National Register is. If you look at designed landscapes, these are almost to a project the kinds of places that are looked at as being designed by some type of professional. And what I did here was the number represents the number in that category that is represented in the state of Connecticut. So you see, except for exhibition and fairs, and I was kind of disappointed to see that the Danbury Fairgrounds wasn't a non-profit project, because I have memories of going there, but there is at least one project in every category, and the asterisk behind the number means it's a category where senior was involved. So you can see in most of these projects there is representation by Frederick Olmsted Sr, and then many were landscape types that were pursued, you know, early into the 20th century. And the other thing about these is many of them are the first of their kind. And I think there was a question that I saw someone asking about, you know, what would be the most important landscape designed by the Olmsted firm in Connecticut? And it's something we can't answer today, because we're really looking at this through a different lens. We want to know what these landscapes meant to the people and communities of Connecticut. But from a national perspective, there are very important projects, and a good example is Seaside Park in Bridgeport. I think all the people who know this Olmsted legacy say it's the only park of its kind that Olmsted Sr designed with Vaux. It's a very early park, and he understood the place he was placing this park in a tidal, you know, the Long Island Sound. He knew this landscape and what it was to put a park in that, you know, interesting environment, and it's the only one of its kind. So that makes it a very interesting and distinct park. And then I think the one I don't know much about because I didn't see it in my visit to Hartford, but that the Landscape for Living, which was an important public ground residential institution in Hartford, Connecticut, was a very early project that Olmsted worked on. And I think another thing about that is, as Chris said, that the restorative and health value of the landscape was so important to Olmsted. And when he worked on these kinds of residential institutions, he is thinking about how the people who will be there will be healed by the places available to them. So that becomes a really important landscape that survives in Hartford, and one that's of particular interest to Sr himself. But we will learn through this process and the various themes that we will go through to know more about, you know, we will learn, you know, about landscapes that, you know, may not seem significant today, but when you look at in the context of Connecticut and the themes under which it falls, may stand out as, you know, nationally significant. So that's why we've got Jenny Scofield and Chris Wiegand on our team to help us with this project. So I think that's the only other slide I have.
So the documentation project undertaken, we hope will be well underway, nearly completed by the time of Frederick's 200th birthday in next April. The idea is, of course, for somebody as important as Frederick Law Olmsted, there are reams and rafts of material available about him, but there's really very little that really focuses on Connecticut itself. So that's our goal here, is to really look at Olmsted in Connecticut. So the project will have two principal parts. The first is a context report, which Lucy mentioned. Sort of a statewide report which will address the state Connecticut's contributions to Frederick Law Olmsted, the Olmsted firm, and the development of landscape architecture. We'll look at, you know, Olmsted's life in Connecticut, his upbringing, and see how that affected his life. We'll look at places such as Brooksvale Farm in Cheshire, which belonged to members of his family, which he visited frequently, and which is still owned by relatives of the Olmsted family. Places like Collinsville, where Olmsted studied for a bit, and then Old North Cemetery, where he is buried in Hartford. So we'll try and look at, you know, what society was like in Connecticut, where he traveled. He wrote about his memories of sitting on the horse in front of his father and looking at landscape as they traveled around the state, and see how all this fits together and fits into the larger context of the work of the Olmsted firm. And the second part, after the context report, is a survey that Lucy listed all the types of landscapes that the Olmsted firm worked on in Connecticut. If you added up all those numbers, you'd get 298 jobs. Sometimes there will be more than one job in a particular place, but 298 distinct jobs that the firm worked on and assigned a tracking number to. And we're going to try and find out, as many as possible, how many of those were actually carried out, how many of them still exist, and in what condition are they in. Basically, we're estimating that the survey will cover about 150 sites throughout the state. This whole project is being funded by a grant from the State Historic Preservation Office with funding generated by the Connecticut Community Investment Act. The consultant team put together by Redbridge Group, which is a heritage consulting group based in San Francisco, but they have an East Coast presence as well. They put together a team of knowledgeable and experienced landscape architects and historians who will carry out the most of the work. Another part of the project will be some outreach to community groups in Bridgeport and Hartford. You've heard from Lucy, Alicia Luba, and Liz Sargent from the team are also with us on the call, and I didn't see if there was anybody else or not. Whoops. We'll provide updates as we go along. So next, Jenny Scofield, the National Register Coordinator from the State Historic Preservation Office, will talk a little bit about how you survey historic landscapes. So Jenny, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to add too that this project that we're doing is coinciding with a variety of events under the name of Olmsted 200. So you can look up Olmsted 200, and Lucy and Chris can add more about that later. So I just wanted to add, why bother? Why do we want to survey landscapes? What do we want to find out? A lot of times we experience a place and have certain feeling or have certain experience when we're there, but don't necessarily notice all of the things that contribute to that experience or that history and why we're feeling that way. So a survey helps us figure out what are the features that make a place look like it does. And also it's really important to understand the many layers of history that have occurred there, because while one firm may have designed something or one land use may have resulted in a component on the landscape, usually there are a lot of different components that make a place look and feel the way it does. So a survey just helps us get a better understanding of that. In terms of the State Historic Preservation Office, we are hoping to use this project as sort of a launching pad for a stronger program of landscape documentation overall. We have generated a landscape inventory form that we'll be testing out that we're hoping could be applied to any type of landscape, not just Olmsted firm and not just designed landscape. So that inventory form could be used for vernacular landscapes, like you're seeing a couple examples of here. And we're also hoping to develop the language and skills for landscape documentation to get better representation of setting and landscape qualities in our other types of work as well, including historic designations. And all of this really contributes to ultimately to preservation when you understand what's there and what treatment options you have for maintaining it. Next. So I was going to put together a little timeline of events for you, and I remembered that there's a really great one online already through the National Park Service. So there's a link here where you can get an understanding of, within the preservation field, when did we start to integrate landscape documentation into our programs? And there's some key dates here, particularly throughout the 1990s, was a moment when cultural landscapes as a terminology became accepted and widely used and integrated. The National Park Service begins to inventory officially cultural landscapes at this time in 1992. And a few years later, the Cultural Landscape Foundation is established, and the Park Service followed that by establishing the Historic American Landscape Survey, which is similar to their pre-existing HABS program. And in Connecticut, at the same time, the SHPO and Preservation Connecticut did a survey of town greens throughout the state, which is on Preservation Connecticut's website and still accessible. And a few years later, surveyed about 59 of the municipally owned parks throughout the state. Next. So here's a preview, a spoiler alert. Here is our new inventory form. It's just a draft right now, but we'll be testing this out and improving this. It includes some of the categories that you might be familiar with if you've done cultural landscape inventories. And I want to emphasize, even if you're not a landscape architect, which I'm not, just to think about when you're documenting something, what is the topography like? What is the natural geology that you're working with? What are the layers of use on that property? You can go to the next slide. What are the spatial arrangements like? So are there zones of use, or are things clustered? Is there a difference about how the landscape looks at the periphery? And in terms of vegetation, is the vegetation functional, or is it decorative? Is it ornamental? Is it naturally occurring or native plant material, or does it look invasive or replanted or foreign to the area? And there's also a lot to think about in terms of views and vistas. I will quickly define that a view is a panoramic or broad landscape view that could be either naturally occurring or made. And then a vista is a distinct, more linear range of vision that's usually intentionally maintained or created to frame a view. So you've got a view from the Appalachian Trail here, and then an image of an orchard on a historic farm landscape that's now a park. You can go next. Okay, and going back to my point about topography and geology, in projects generated from non-landscape professionals, I feel like we're always forgetting this. We're always forgetting, are we on a flat space or hill? Are you near a water source? Are there rocks there? That has incredible impact on the way a place looks and feels, or may have been used in history, and soil as well. So this is just for fun, showing you, you know, in the northwest corner, we have an incredible amount of glacial rock. Some of it, you know, gets dug out for foundations and placed, and some of it you really have to just work around. So here's an example of some landscaping that's done sort of working around what's already there. And then similar feature that was actually specifically selected and relocated to this municipal park. Next. Okay, so I just want to give everybody an idea of what we might be looking at within the Olmsted project. And keep in mind, you know, any strategies we develop hopefully could be applied in lots of projects and surveys coming down the road. So this is a National Register listed historic district in Torrington, which was the site of an 8-acre estate by an industrialist who was involved in the mills nearby. in terms of the history of this landscape, it was generally farmland at one point and becomes an estate after the Civil War. You can go to the next. Yeah. So here's a 1930s aerial where you could see the estate as it looked in 1936. The original owner of the estate's son demolished his house and built his own house around 1890, and that's the one in the center there. And then a fellow industrialist and a family member built houses to either side. The Olmsted brothers, or Olmsted associates, did a lot of work for members of the family and the owners here on these 3 parcels in the early 20th century. Next. So this is what the site looks like now in an aerial photo. Laurelhurst is the earliest remaining building. It's the center of the estate. The Bryant house was an industrialist, and the Turner house was related family. And the Olmsted brothers were hired multiple times, and they were also working on Hillside Cemetery in Torrington at the same time. The same time they were developing the cemetery and monuments for many of the industrialist families, they were also working on the estates of the families. And in the correspondence for Olmsted, you see a lot of commentary about the other projects at the same time. Next. So here's some of the work that they started to look at. They did a lot of editing of the original Midgeon estate. So there's a letter here talking about which plants should be retained or which ones should be edited out or taken away. And there's an image at the bottom here about Olmsted Online, which we're hoping to integrate our project into. And Olmsted Online is an online database where you can actually link to some of the images and maps of Olmsted projects. Next. So here is the Olmsted firm documenting the view from the center of the estate of the streetscape. And they were actually concerned about the view of these lovely houses at the time and wanting more privacy from them. Next. Okay, so this is Laurelhurst. This is the house that was in the center of the estate, and the Olmsted firm did a lot of editing work on the landscape material that was there. You can see what's left of it. And I apologize for the difference in views. I was just taking photos from the street. So there's still, some natural topography you can observe, and some plantings remain, but not all. Next. Here's another view of the grounds of Laurelhurst. So there are some pathways still, and some of the trees that may look natural, but were specifically placed. And I don't actually know, I haven't studied this particular landscape enough to know which date to the original Midgeon estate post-Civil War and which plant material dates to the Olmsted work. Next. So this is the house at the very end that was built a little bit later, early 20th century. And you can see that the house looks much the same. There's a lot of carefully placed plantings around the house and then throughout the lawn. And I'd say it maybe has about 50% of the plant material that looks like it was there previously. Next. Okay, and this is fun. So up at the north end of this original estate, there was a house constructed in 1910. And then the Olmsted brothers designed a very formal landscape, which you see in the blueprint. It's not matched up exactly, but it's pretty close. So there's a plaza with some fancy steps, and then a specifically designated area for a natural environment. And the garage that you're seeing up at the top is still extant. But if you click, this is what we have now. The house was demolished in 1966, and this nursing home was built in 1968. Next. But here's what's left of it. So the house is gone, and the plaza, all the terracing is gone. There's a little bit of plant material, and primarily what you can see in the landscape is the perimeter fence that, so there's the stone wall at the rear edge of the lot, and then the piers and iron fence that was used to screen and provide privacy. So that's just a little snapshot about what we're hoping to do and some of the work that we'll be looking at throughout the project.
Thank you, Jenny. As Jenny mentioned, this is only one facet of what's really a nationwide celebration of Olmsted's birthday. The sort of national activities are being coordinated by the National Organization of Olmsted Parks, National Association of Olmsted Parks, rather. Lucy's a former board chair and current board member, or former, but been involved with the organization. And they've set up what they're calling Olmsted 200, a separate website to coordinate events that are happening all over the country, sponsored by different groups. So you may want to look at that to meet more, learn more about Olmsted, and see what other events are taking place. Because of the richness of the background of his life, in addition to landscape, all those other activities and themes that he was interested in, a lot of that is being worked into the observances as well. So it's landscape, it's nature, it's conservation, it's public health, it's social equity, it's about access to recreational and park spaces. All those will be worked into the celebration by different groups. As a preservation organization, our main emphasis, of course, is documenting what's there, preserving what's important, but preserving also includes making spaces useful, making spaces continue to serve the present day needs of the society of Connecticut and its people. So, we're interested in some of those other topics as well, and we'll work them into the documentation project as we can. Just to close, here are some resources, online resources that you might want to look at. Preservation Connecticut will be posting updates on our website or our social media accounts. The State Historic Preservation Office, there's the Olmsted 200, as well as the National Association of Olmsted Parks as well. Connecticut has an Olmsted Legacy Trail, a website marking some of the places that Frederick Law Olmsted worked on and telling you about his Connecticut background, which was created and is maintained by the Connecticut chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And we're in conversation frequently and working with the chapter of ASLA on this project as well. They'll be brought into it at various times, and I see that we've got some landscape architects on the call as well. So that's what we're doing and what we're about. And Jane, do you want to moderate the questions and answers session, and we can try and focus them too? Yeah.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. As I said earlier, you can post questions in the chat or raise your hand or speak up. And we do have a few questions that were submitted prior to our call. Wendy Belmore, you have a question?
I do indeed. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Truly appreciate hearing all the efforts that are underway. One of the things that we've become more aware of just locally is the fact that a tremendous amount of storms and storm damage has been felt throughout even the smallest parks or town centers, and we're losing a lot of heritage trees. And I'm wondering if included in your discussion of Olmsted 200, will you be talking about some of those heritage trees as part of the historic preservation of these landscapes?
Who
Lucy,
would like
you
to
want to?
take that?
Oops.
Yes, I would say, I mean, we actually have an unnamed consultant yet, who we hope when we visit these properties, the most likely surviving living resource will be the trees. I mean, trees were so important to the work that the Olmsted firm did in the planting plans, which is only a part of the work that was done at any particular site. And so as we find those large or significant trees, we will identify them, hopefully, by the use of the planting plan as well, and a plant list that we hope to have to accompany those projects. And I think we will, we'll be highlighting those in our survey as contributing resources. And then the question of how then do you, increase the longevity of these trees? I mean, that's a preservation treatment question that will have to be a deeper discussion with those property owners and the state and others. But we will at least, I hope, be able to, let everyone know the kinds of significant trees and vegetation that we see, because they are so important to the landscapes we'll be surveying.
Thank you so much for that response. I think this is the momentum that even smaller communities need to follow your lead, so to speak. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you for your question. Barbara Yeager, would you like to go next? You have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm driving, so I'm driving to Florida. I just wanted to let everybody know that NAOP, the National Association of Olmsted Parks, and myself, who lives in Connecticut, are planning to try to contact historic societies and see if they can look in their archives and find information on potentially the clients and the projects that Olmsted worked on. And we're hoping to have a workshop in early July that will assist those societies in how to use the Olmsted Online website and also the Library of Congress website to find out more information on potential projects or potential clients that lived in their communities. So they could help us find more information about the projects and the clients in the Olmsteds. So I just wanted to give people a heads up on that.
Thanks. Yes, and who knows, we may even discover some projects that aren't on the official list yet.
And this is Lucy jumping in, and exactly, and I want to thank Jenny for adding that slide where there's a letter that the Olmsted firm wrote with many of the recommendations that apply to Laurelhurst. And that's exactly the kind of thing that this research will point out, is that even though there's a project number, there are plans and drawings, there may even be planting plans and plant lists, it's the correspondence that went on between the owner, the client, and the firm that had lots of recommendations and material that you could not know by the plans and drawings and plant lists. I mean, and so all these pieces, and especially things that might be held in local archives, are so important to how successful we are. That we'll be as successful as teasing out those detailed pieces of information, because they often hold the most interesting and most important decision making that happens around a property, especially in through the 20th century. What happens to our later and contemporary landscapes, I don't know, because it's got all to be online, but those that are written into letters are so important.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Mary Pelletier, would you like to ask your question?
I wanted to follow up on the landscape, the health of landscape. Most of the pictures you showed were primarily of estates, but I can't emphasize enough that Olmsted, I work with the park watershed, Park Watershed's a 501c3, which is the first, municipal park paid for by voter funds. And it was really around the restoration of water. So there's a confluence of the 200th anniversary, the celebration of Olmsted, and the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. So I would say that for the Preservation Connecticut inventory form, you might consider adding some questions about the connectivity of landscapes in relationship to the area around it. And then one other question. So I have 2 points. One point was to follow up on the trees, that the problem of mowing, the excessive mowing, which didn't happen during Olmsted's time, is that we are cutting down the tree seedlings that are coming from these historic trees that are pre-European tree stock. And they're often being replaced by cultivars from, a nursery, and hopefully some of this research can review the maintenance practices that could help our resiliency moving forward. And then again, the last question, the question I started with is, will landscapes, large landscapes and municipal parks be a focus of this research? And will there be quantification of the numbers of acres conserved during that time, in relationship to Olmsted's efforts?
And I can comment at one of the 2 focuses of this project is to do a historical context for the Olmsted legacy, which is specific to Connecticut. And as part of that, we will be documenting, at least in the context, anything associated with the Olmsted firm as a whole through the full term that Olmsted Sr. and all the legacy firms worked through. Even if we don't inventory each landscape that we find associated with the firm, we're hoping to report on that in this report and have an idea of the total entity. We haven't talked about quantifying acres, but that's certainly something we could consider. And I'll let my partners think about that as well. So thank you for that suggestion.
And you mentioned estates as well, and you may have noticed on the list that the far and away the largest number of Olmsted firm jobs in Connecticut was for private estates and residential properties. Frankly, a lot of the parks have had some documentation done already. Jenny mentioned the survey of municipal parks that was done in the 1990s. So, what we look at will be partly informed by what's already been documented, partly informed by how much stuff there is. And yet at the same time, a lot of those residential properties may have been altered or just maybe private and not interested in having people tromping around them. So we have to take that in mind as well. We're still sort of working on what we'll actually be able to get access to. And we may need local assistance sometimes if people who know an owner and might be able to persuade them that it would be a good thing to let us in.
Great. Thanks, Chris and Jenny. Did that answer all of your questions, Mary?
Yes, but I think there's a big piece of this that's related to landscape connectivity that may not be connected to buildings, and that piece is particularly important to future generations as the nature-based solutions and in encouraging elected officials to conserve landscapes. There may have been landscapes recommended for conservation, certainly along the North Branch of the Park River, Olmsted wrote a letter in 1871 to Charles Pond to conserve land, that the streets were laid out in a way that did preserve the land, but it's not formally conserved. And so I'm hoping those types of last landscapes are captured in this survey.
Great, thank you. So one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time for the panel, are the landscape areas updated with different plant material, or is it the goal to maintain the originally designed plantings and replace them with exactly the same variety when necessary? Be a tricky one to answer, but I'll let you give it a go.
I think I was supposed to jump on that one. And I would say, that comes with a whole different level of research. The preservation treatment of any historic resource is something that's done with a lot of research that we won't do for this statewide survey. But just generally, the kinds of preservation treatment, what you apply to those kinds of questions is, what survives from the historic period? How significant was that plant material to the design? And then, is that plant material considered an invasive exotic today? Is it sustainable? Is it something that can be used? So there's a whole tier of questions that go along with that kind of decision making that almost every historic landscape requires, because like every living thing, trees, shrubs, ground covers age out and need to be replaced or at least rejuvenated. So those are really, really important questions, something that everyone who does historic landscape struggles with. And I would just say that would come up for us on probably an individual landscape basis, and whether or not we would have the information to help anyone make decisions around future landscape treatments is a question we would ask Jenny and Chris and others. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and to the one who posed the question, if you want to talk more specifically about your site, you can contact us and we can try to address some of those questions for you. Another question. Let's see, some of these we've answered. How can Connecticut honor Olmsted and his extensive forward-thinking network of colleagues by conserving last landscapes in urban areas? Do you have some thoughts on that? How do we best honor the legacy of Olmsted?
Can somebody explain? I'm like Jenny, I'm not a landscape historian. So what is a last landscape?
Well, I would say the best, this is Lucy jumping in again, but I would say one of the best ways is this kind of survey. The first thing you can do to honor this legacy is to really know what survives in Connecticut. And when we learn how many places still benefit from the work done by this firm and the people who added to and maybe even preceded the work by the Olmsted firm, because that's something else that this survey hopes to tease out, is we know humans tend to go to the same places over and over again because certain places have qualities that we as humans like. So the word that you hear often enough is palimpsest, that they're layers of occupation that precedes the Olmsted landscapes and the clients that they worked for, and follows because there's a need to adapt this place for contemporary use. So we want to make sure this survey honors, to the extent possible, the other professionals who are working in the state and intersect with these places. So that's really important. And anyone who has information about that, we would like to know, because it's not just the Olmsteds, it's the work that they inspire and the work that the community wants for itself. And that the places that the Olmsted works are often the places the community goes back to and says, there's something else that needs to be added here, something needs to be changed here for our benefit. So I think that's the most important thing to know, is where are those places and how do the communities benefit from this landscape legacy that it appears to be sort of statewide. So that's, I think, one way.
Actually, this is Mary. I'm the one that asked that question. And if I can just explain what a last landscape is, I'm part of the Friends of Conte, which is the Silvio Conte National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. So regionally across the past 20 years throughout New England, there's been a considerable conservation of lands in the hinterlands, but there's been very little conservation of lands. In fact, there's been a lot of sort of chipping away at this sort of the open spaces around St. Joseph's College, around the American School for the Deaf, around St. Mary's. Those landscapes that were maybe under nonprofits or whatever, maybe they're Olmsted, maybe not, have been cashed in for property for new development. And that's left people in urban areas, the increasing populations without access to nature, and there's some concern about that.
Great. Thanks, Mary.
And I just say, I hope that we can highlight some of those themes in the context and sort of tie that into the legacy of what Olmsted was trying to achieve. And not just to focus on him, but how he carried that through, how that was carried through by others. So hopefully if we can highlight that in the report, that would at least help with the mindset for that.
Yeah, and there was also a comment in the chat about it would be interesting to see the impact of pest epidemics on the Olmsted specimen trees. So a lot of great suggestions coming from the audience. One person asked something that may be somewhat subjective, but what is the location of Olmsted's most memorable garden design in Connecticut? Chris, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Gosh, we're still trying to find things out. I don't think of Frederick Law Olmsted primarily in terms of gardens. I know some of the landscapes I know where he created them, he tended to sort of tuck them away in a corner because they were maybe, at their best at a particular time of the year and not part of this general idea of the naturalistic sweeping pastoral landscape that was his primary focus. So I'd have to pass that off. I don't know of a garden design specifically in Connecticut that we would.
And I would just say, most likely, if I understand the term garden as it's used here, it would most likely go with one of those residential properties, the estates and all. And they most often are done in the 20th century by a successor firm, the Olmsted brothers or the associate. And to the extent that any of that is extant, we know Waveney is one of those residential properties that has changed itself into a public park, but that's an example of one that is in the process of being rehabilitated. But it'd be interesting to see comparing plans that were done for a residential property and the gardens proposed, because they do in the 20th century, because that's the style of day. And then what survives? That would be the question. The bones of that garden may still be there, the beds, lines, the hedges, whether or not the herbaceous layer that would define a garden, if I understand the term correctly, may or may not be there depending on who the owner is and their level of skill or their level of funds to get a gardener in. But I would say one of the resources we'll definitely be looking at is the Smithsonian collection that was donated by, I think, Garden Club of America, that is of this period. And there are many Olmsted garden landscapes that are preserved in those photographs from the period. So we'll be seeing, so I don't, like Chris said, I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but we will have more information as we do the survey and be able to tell you where there have been some and whether they survived today. We won't know that till we get out there and survey.
Great, thank you. And there was one other question that was submitted earlier. Have you seen any mention from Olmsted about how the steam shovel impacted his work?
Lucy, I'm afraid we're going to have to turn to you again.
You know, the only piece of equipment that I remember reading about is really associated with Central Park. And one of the things they do say about Central Park, which is developed, started before the Civil War, so late 1850s, and then again after the Civil War, is the only piece of equipment they had was a rock breaker that Olmsted had seen at a Paris exposition. The rest is done by hand. So that is, I mean, if you think, and not to say, and I'm sure the historians at Central Park in New York could help show you the places that were hand dug. And I'm sure, steam shovel got used as soon as there was one, because something that took, hundreds of men, possibly days and months to dig out, would go much more quickly. But I would have to know when that steam shovel becomes available, and then where there is I would think, a municipality that is available to use it. But I would say, in research that I did in Georgia on residential properties, that they are that the Olmsted firm brings to Columbus, Georgia in the 30s. So during the Depression, the first application of like sprayed concrete for a pool. So they, being this amazing firm who's doing the first work of its kind in any of the periods, would be a good place to try to tease that out. And so that's one of those questions we have for the park staff at Fairstead, because over the years, they've probably gotten those questions and know more about that. So that's a great question. And I think that evolution of equipment, and certainly mechanical equipment, goes along with the ability to develop certain types of landscapes. So that will be, I don't think that's a theme necessarily for us, but it's something that it would be fascinating to know, because Connecticut, and I don't know, has this great legacy of companies who make all kinds of things. And I have to believe Connecticut was a manufacturer of tools and equipment that was used in landscape work. So again, we'll look to Jenny and Chris to point us that way, but that would be something fascinating to know, who was making those kinds of tools in Connecticut at these times, and how might they apply to the construction of some of these landscapes. So another great question that, that it's a little tangential to the survey, but if we find it, would be a fascinating thing for a community who has the legacy of that work to know and to celebrate locally.
Yeah, I agree. Great questions. And we really appreciate all of the comments that people have made, and feel free to continue the dialogue and submit your questions and suggestions to us. That's what Preservation Connecticut is here for, but also for this survey too, is to really gather all of the information that we can from all of the sources that are available to us. So I appreciate everyone joining us today and submitting your thoughts and questions. And a big thank you to the survey team that joined us, and all the folks from the Redbridge group, and Jenny and Chris. We are going to be sharing your progress as we go along, and look to do big celebrations for Olmsted's birthday next spring. And I hope you'll all join us next week. We'll be talking with Sarah Marstrom, who's a national consultant in historic preservation, who's been shaking things up a little bit on the national landscape, and dismantling preservation is her baby, which is a conference that she runs, a virtual conference in the summer, and she's gonna talk about how much fun preservation is. So I hope you can join us for that. And again, thank you to all of our guests. Really appreciate your time, and looking forward to working with you as we go forward. Thanks so much.